Welcome to our channel. Subscribe, leave your like, and activate the bell for new videos and have a good story. Every Friday evening, as the city prepares to wind down, the main train station comes alive not with noise, but with notes. Somewhere between the distant sound of arriving trains and the rhythmic footsteps of weary commuters, a piano begins to sing. It's not a concert hall, nor a polished grand piano. It's just an old upright, slightly out of tune, tucked in a corner near a platform. But when he sits down, the entire station transforms. He arrives at the same time every week without fail. A tall figure in a dark coat, hands tucked in his pockets, carrying a worn satchel slung over his shoulder. His steps are quiet, unhurried. He walks as if the world isn't racing past him, as if time has already taught him not to rush. He never looks around, never tries to draw attention to himself. He simply takes his place at the piano, opens the lid, and begins to play. No sign, no bucket, no appeal for money. Only a modest gray hat resting on the ground near the pedals, more tradition than request. He doesn't speak. He rarely even looks up. But the way he plays, that speaks volumes. The first few chords seem to hush the air around him. Even the station's chaotic rhythm, a blend of metal wheels, station announcements, hurried conversations, fades beneath the music. His fingers dance across the keys, weaving classical pieces with improvisations so personal they feel like confessions. Chopin turns into jazz. Jazz melts into lullabies. Each melody feels as though it was created for this very moment, for whoever happens to be listening. Commuters pause, some linger, drawn by a sound that feels strangely familiar, yet new. A child clutches her mother's hand, eyes wide, enchanted. An elderly man in a trench coat taps his cane softly to the rhythm. A group of teenagers, at first laughing among themselves, fall silent as the piano changes tone, slower now, more introspective. There's something in the way he plays that silences people, not with volume, but with truth. Nobody knows his name. Not really. Regulars have invented a few. The Station Pianist, Friday Night Symphony, the Ghost of Platform 4. But he remains a mystery. Some say he used to be a famous concert pianist who vanished after a personal tragedy. Others believe he's homeless, that the piano is all he has. There are even those who claim he's just a ghost, a spirit who appears only on Fridays to remind the city of something, its forgotten beauty, maybe, or love. But these are just stories. The only facts are what people see and hear. A man, a piano, and music that sounds like it's coming from a place deeper than memory. What no one knows is that this ritual, this silent concert, began long ago. It started on a Friday evening like any other. The station was cold that day, the wind slipping in through the high-arched windows. The pianist had been walking for hours, uncertain of where he was going, carrying only a notebook filled with unfinished compositions and a mind filled with ghosts. He passed the piano without meaning to. Then he stopped. There was something about it. Maybe it was the silence around it, the way no one was playing it, even though it sat there waiting, exposed and unguarded. Or maybe it was just that he had nowhere else to go. He sat down and placed his hands on the keys. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't think. He just played. That night, He didn't even notice the people watching. He didn't notice the young woman who stood behind a pillar, holding her suitcase tighter than necessary, her eyes glassy from a week that had broken her in quiet ways. He didn't notice the boy who recorded part of the performance and uploaded it to a music blog that would go viral the following week. He only knew that for those few hours, the music gave him peace. So he returned the next week and the next, until it became the only appointment in his life that mattered. Some people come just to hear him now. They don't take the train. They don't even live nearby. They come to the station as a destination, a kind of pilgrimage for something pure. Some bring coffee or pastries, leaving them near the piano in quiet gratitude. Others leave behind nothing but a look, a gaze held a little longer than usual, a quiet nod of acknowledgement before disappearing into the night. And still, he says nothing. To most, he's still a mystery. But if you look closely, you'll notice certain patterns. He plays brighter, more joyful pieces when it rains. He finishes every night with the same soft melody, a song that doesn't exist in any book or recording. It's his own, one he never wrote down. And during the final notes, he closes as if every time light he's remembering someone. The station staff grew used to him. They started calling him the piano ghost. A few even adjusted the cleaning schedule to make sure the area around the piano was always clean before Friday night. One janitor swore she once saw him crying after playing a piece that sounded like a lullaby. But if he did, wiped it away before anyone else noticed. And then there's the hat, the old gray hat that sits on the floor. He never touches it, never looks inside, but every week, something ends up in it. Sometimes coins, sometimes a note. One time, someone left a pressed flower. Another week, a hand-drawn picture of him at the piano, sketched by a child with too much imagination and a pack of colored pencils. But one night, something different happened. Tucked carefully between a folded bill and a chocolate wrapper was a small piece of stationery. It was handwritten in blue ink with a simple message. Your music makes the world feel less heavy. Thank you for sharing it. No name, no signature, just that. He read it. For the first time, he held something from the hat. He didn't react. Not visibly. But that night, the final piece he played was different, more tender. Like he was answering the letter with notes instead of words. That note would not be the last. From then on, every Friday, a new message appeared. Different handwriting, different paper, but always placed with care. Always personal. And though he never said a word aloud, something had changed. It started with just one note. She hadn't planned to write it. In fact, she hadn't even planned to stop at the piano that night. She was running the platform clock ticked with its usual indifference, and the station was pulsing with Friday fatigue. People moved fast, clutching bags, phones, cups of coffee that had long gone cold. But there, at the far end of the platform, she heard him. The piano. That sound had become a strange comfort over the past few months. At first, it had caught her by accident on a night when she'd been too exhausted to walk fast, too overwhelmed to care. She'd sat on a bench, not even looking toward the sound, and cried silently behind her scarf. But the music wrapped around her like a blanket, unexpected and tender. She didn't know why, but it made her feel less alone. It made her feel seen, even if nobody was looking. Since then, she began to time her Fridays just to hear a few minutes of it. Sometimes she'd linger longer. Other times, She'd miss him by a few minutes and feel oddly disappointed, like she'd missed a friend she'd never really met. But that night, she wanted to say something. So she dug into a bag, pulled out a page torn from her planner, and scribbled a message before she could overthink it. Your music makes the world feel less heavy. Thank you for sharing it. She folded. He hesitated, then leaned forward and slipped it into the gray head resting by the piano. He never looked up, never stopped playing. But something about the curve of his back, the stillness of his head, made her think he'd felt it. She left before the piece ended. The following Friday, she came back earlier. She wasn't sure what she was expecting. Maybe nothing. Maybe just to hear the music again. But this time, she brought another note, something even simpler. The song you played last week has been in my head all week. It was beautiful. She left it quietly and waited a few paces back. He glanced down after the piece ended. He picked it up, held it in his hand for a moment, then placed it gently into his coat pocket. No expression, no reaction. But that night, he played something softer, slower, as if answering. And that's how it began. A silent conversation between two strangers. Every week, a new note. Some were short and shy. Others were long and confessional. She told him things she hadn't told anyone in years. About the stress of her job, the loneliness of the city, the way music had always been her secret escape. She didn't sign them. Not once. But she always used the same kind of papery vari-colored stationery with a subtle texture and always folded them the same way. She never stayed long enough to see if he read them. But he did, and he began to reply. In Melodies, after her note about losing her childhood pet, he played a gentle lullaby with high, hopeful notes that made her cry before she reached the stairs. After she mentioned how rainy days made her feel small and quiet, he played something light and playful, like the dance of raindrops on a windowpane. It became their unspoken language, her words. His music. Weeks passed, then months. The notes became more detailed. She began to describe little things she noticed. How his posture changed with each piece, how his left hand always started before his right, how he seemed to drift somewhere else entirely when he closed his eyes at the final note. She shared memories, favorite songs, old dreams she'd forgotten. She asked him questions, too not expecting answers, but writing them anyway. Do you play for someone? Is there a song that scares you? What does silence sound like to you? He never responded with words, but the way he played seemed like a kind of response, coded in sound. One Friday, she asked in her note, is this your way of speaking to the world? That night, he played a piece that started quiet, unsure. Then it grew bolder, louder, braverant. It filled the station with a kind of determined joy. It ended on a single, lingering note, a whisper that seemed to say, yes. She smiled the entire way home. People around the station began to notice the notes too. A few curious onlookers started peeking into the hat, wondering what treasures it held. One staff member joked that the pianist had a secret admirer. Another said it was probably just a publicity stunt for some kind of art project. But the notes kept coming, and the music never stopped. The woman never told anyone. It wasn't about the crowd. It wasn't about being seen. In fact, part of her feared being seen. What if he knew what she looked like? Would it ruin the mystery? Would it end the spell? She preferred this anonymity that gave her the courage to be honest. It was like writing letters to someone who existed in a dream. And somehow, that dream was becoming the most honest part of her life. Then came the note she almost didn't write. She had been feeling overwhelmed. Work had drained her. Life felt heavy in ways she couldn't explain. And the thought crossed her mind, what was the point? He didn't know who she was. He didn't write back. She could disappear, and he'd never know her name. But she wrote the note anyway. Some weeks, your music is the only thing that makes sense. Thank you for not giving up. She folded it slower this time, placed it in the hat like a fragile secret, and sat down on the bench near the vending machines, determined to stay until the last note. That night, he played something she'd never heard before. A piece that moved like a story shifting from sadness to hope to something close to joy. It wasn't perfect. There were pauses, a wrong note or two, but it felt alive. Raw. Like he was playing for her, only her. She didn't know it yet, but he had started to recognize her too. Not Efasi. He never looked up long enough. But her presence, the way she lingered near the pillar, always dressed in layers like she never got used to the station's chill. The way she held her bag against her chest when the music got soft. He didn't know her name, but he knew her silences, her stillness, her rhythm. And each week, when he saw her walking toward the piano, his hands felt steadier. The notes began to change. Not just in content, but in meaning. He wasn't playing for the crowd anymore, not really. He was playing for the voice behind the notes. The one who wrote about invisible things. The one who thanked him not for perfection, but for presence. And then, one week, no note. He looked into the hat at the end of his final piece. Empty. The station was quieter than usual. He scanned the benches, the pillar, the vending machine corner. She wasn't there. He sat a moment longer than usual, his fingers still hovering over the keys. Then he picked up and left, just as he always did. But this Jimmy step was slower. The following Friday, the hat was empty again. Then, another. He began to worry in ways he couldn't explain. Maybe she'd moved. Maybe she was sick. Maybe she had simply outgrown this ritual. But he missed her words. Not just for the encouragement, but for the way they made him feel. Connected. Like someone out there truly listened. He kept playing anyway. Every Friday. Always hoping. And far away, in a small cafe across town, she sat alone, watching the rain against the glass. She hadn't been back to the station in 3 weeks, not because she didn't want to, but because she was scared of being seen disappointed, of ruining something beautiful. But that night, she decided next Friday she would go back, and maybe this time she wouldn't just leave a note. Some people fall in love through long walks or late-night conversations. Others, through shared meals, exchanged glances, or the accidental brushing of hands. But for them, the connection was built without a single word spoken aloud. No names, no faces clearly seen. Just notes in a hat, melodies in the air, and a growing silence that somehow said everything. She returned to the station that Friday, heart pounding, hands shaking. It had been nearly a month since her last note, and she had rehearsed every step of her return. She arrived earlier than usual, hoping to see him to witness him from afar, to ground her reality in something more than imagination. But when she arrived, he was already there, seated at the piano, head bowed, hands still, as if waiting for something. As if he had missed something. She hesitated near the stairs, watching, Her eyes searched for signs of change. He looked exactly the same, and yet something felt different. There was a weight in his shoulders, a question in the air. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the notes she had folded and refolded a dozen times. A simple message: "I'm sorry for the silence. I didn't know how much I needed this until I walked away." She stepped forward. Her heart beat louder than the station's announcements. As she approached the piano, she bent down gently, placed the note into the hat, and without thinking looked at him. He looked up for the first time. Their eyes met for only a moment, but the moment stretched, filled with something neither could name. Recognition, surprise, relief, she couldn't tell. But she knew one thing. The music that followed wasn't for the crowd. It was for her. That night, he played differently. Slower, more vulnerable, like he was no longer performing but confessing. And she stayed until the very last note. From that moment on, the exchange became something sacred. Every Friday, she left Anulunganao. More intimate, she wrote about her week, her memories, her fears. She told him about a recurring dream of walking through a foggy city and hearing piano music through the mist. She told him about a book she read as a child where two souls met lifetime after lifetime without knowing each other's names. And she told him about her fear that the beauty of what they shared only existed because it was unseen. He never replied with words, but his music grew more complex, more alive. Each piece seemed to carry her words into the air and return them to her, transformed. She began to feel that the entire station belonged to them during those hours. The people came and went. The announcements echoed. The trains rushed by. But in that space between notes and paper, a bond was forming that no one else could see. They began to learn one another in strange ways. She noticed how he always cracked his knuckles once before playing, how he kept a small photograph tucked into the lid of the piano too far for her to see clearly, but always there. She noticed he played faster when the station was louder, as if challenging the noise, and softer when the world slowed down. He noticed how she always stood near the same pillar, how she sometimes arrived looking tired, her eyes red, and he'd adjust the tone of his pieces accordingly, choosing songs that soothed rather than stirred. He noticed how her coat changed with the seasons, how her scarf matched her notebooks, how her gaze followed the keys instead of the man behind them. They were strangers by every societal measure, yet she knew the rhythm of his soul in a way no one else did. He knew the tone of her spirit through her words more deeply than any friend ever had. One Friday, her note asked a simple question. "Do you ever wish we'd met differently?" That night, he played a piece she had never heard his own composition. Raw and jagged, filled with tension and yearning. It wasn't polished, it wasn't safe, but it was honest. It spoke of roads not taken, moments missed, and the strange beauty of what was, despite what could have been. She cried the entire time. From that moment on, the tone of the exchange began to shift. The notes grew more reflective. She wrote about the people in her life who never truly saw her, about feeling invisible even in a room full of love, about how, for the first time, she felt understood without ever having spoken aloud. One evening, she left him a poem, just a few lines. "You play what I don't know how to say, and I write what you no longer speak. But in the quiet between us, there's a language only we keep." He played nothing that night that resembled anything she knew, just improvised chords, gentle, imperfect, echoing like waves retreating into a distant sea. It was Somehow, the most personal thing she'd ever heard. The weeks rolled on. Their ritual continued, but outside the station, life kept moving. Her job became more demanding. Responsibilities piled up. Friends asked why she kept vanishing on Friday nights. She smiled and said she had a standing appointment. They never knew how true that was. One day, a friend pressed further. "You've been writing letters to someone every week. Are you in love with him?" She paused, then whispered, "I don't know." How could she explain it? She didn't know his name, didn't know his story, but she knew how he moved when he was trying not to feel. She knew the sound of his joy, the rhythm of his sorrow. She knew the color of his silence, and she had fallen in love with that. One Friday, her note said, "Sometimes I wonder what your voice sounds like. Not your piano. You. Just you." That night, he didn't play at first. He just sat at the piano, staring at the keys. Then, slowly, he placed his fingers down and began to play one note at a time. A simple melody, almost like a music box. It felt like the beginning of something, or the end. She knew what it meant. There was only so long they could hide in this space between reality and fiction. Eventually, something would have to change or end. The following Friday, she made a decision. She wrote a note that said, "If you want to meet, really meet, I'll be standing by the vending machines at the end of your last song. If not, I'll understand. No more notes. Just thank you." She placed it into the hat and walked away. Her heart was breaking and beating with equal force. She waited by the vending machine, her breath shallow, her pulse in her throat. He played. The song was soft, familiar, the same melody he played every week at the end, but slower, more tentative. It felt like goodbye, or maybe a promise. When the final note rang out, she held her breath. He stood. He walked toward the vending machines. And for the first time in months of letters, music, and silence, they faced each other, two strangers. Not strangers. Their story wasn't written in names. It was written in notes, folded letters, and the echoes of a piano in a cold train station. But now, they were ready to speak. It had become a ritual more sacred than routine. Every Friday evening, no matter the weather, no matter the week she'd had, she found herself drawn to the train station. Not to travel, not to escape, but to arrive. To arrive at a moment, a sound, a feeling. The moment when the first piano notes rose above the noise of the city and wrapped the world in something quieter, softer, more honest. 4 weeks after their first face-to-face meeting, she kept coming. And so did he. They didn't speak much. Not at first. Their connection was still rooted in silence, in the unspoken rhythm between glances and gestures. A small smile, a shared bench, a folded note, still written now, ending na, because it was needed. But because the act itself had become part of their language, sometimes, after his final song, they would walk outside together into the cool night. Not as lovers, strangers, but something in between. They didn't rush to define it. That would have cheapened it. And neither of them wanted to break the magic by trying to mold it into something ordinary. But then, one Friday, he didn't come. She arrived early, as usual. The piano sat there, alone, untouched. She waited, 15 minutes. Then 30. The hands on the station clock circled indifferently. Still no sign of him. She told herself it was a fluke. Maybe he was caught in traffic. Maybe the train was delayed. Or maybe he'd finally taken a night off. After all, he'd played through storms, blackouts, and once even during a citywide strike. Maybe he just needed rest. But the next Friday, the piano was still silent. And the Friday after that, nothing. No familiar figure with the satchel. No cracked knuckles before the first note. No ghost of a melody to soften the steel and stone of the station's architecture. Just silence. She stood near the vending machines where they'd met. Her reflection in the glass shimmered with confusion and something else, fear. A growing weight in her chest that something had happened. Not just physically, something deeper. Something final. Had he left without saying goodbye? Had their unspoken connection been too much or too little? Or had life real, unpredictable, cruel, life intervened? She began asking questions. First discreetly, then more directly. She spoke with the coffee vendor who sometimes gave the pianists free drinks. He shrugged. Haven't seen him? Not in weeks. She spoke to the station janitor who used to clean near the piano. No idea. Just stopped showing up. Weird, right? Weird didn't begin to describe it. To the world was still a mystery. An anonymous man who had given music to 1,000 strangers and taken nothing in return. But to her, he was more than that. He was a presence, a ritual, a steady note in the chaos of life. And now, he was a silence she couldn't explain. The absence was unbearable. She sat at the piano one night, alone, as commuters rushed past her like she didn't exist. She ran her fingers gently across the keys. The notes sounded brittle, unfamiliar under her touch. She wasn't him. She never could be. But she needed to feel something too. Remember the sound that once lived there. She left a note in the hat anyway. Are you okay? Please come back. Or at least let me know you're all right. I miss the music. I miss you. She returned the next week. The hat was untouched. The next week, she left another note. I don't know where you are, or if you're still out there, but your absence is louder than your music ever was. And that's saying something. Still, nothing. One evening, when the sky was swollen with clouds and the city lights flickered in warning of an incoming storm, she sat on the bench alone and let herself cry. She cried the way she used to before she ever knew him back, when the music had been her only comfort. But this shimmy, the comfort wasn't there. The silence was heavy now. Not peaceful, not sacred, just empty. And so she stopped going. Not because she stopped caring, but because returning to the piano without him felt like reopening a wound that refused to heal. She tried to fill the space in other ways: books, friends, late-night walks. But nothing reached the part of her that had once waited for him. Every Friday, with a note pressed between her fingers like a secret prayer, weeks turned into months. The world moved on. People forgot. But she didn't. His music still played in her memory. Certain melodies brought him back in fragments of minor key, in a passing song, the hum of a tune in a quiet cafe. A piano left open in a library. Every sound reminded her of what was missing. One night, unable to sleep, she went to the station again. It was late. Nearly closing time. The platforms were quiet. A few stragglers waited for the last train. She stood before the piano, aged and neglected now. A thin layer of dust covered the lid. No one had touched it in weeks. She sat down, opened the lid, pressed a single note. It echoed, hesitant and alone. Then she opened her notebook, the same one she used to tear pages from for her letters, and began to write. I don't know why you stopped playing. I don't know if it was by choice or by force, or if life simply pulled you away. But I do know this. You've changed me. Your music gave me something I didn't even know I was missing. You made me feel seen. And now, in your absence, I still feel you. Every Friday, even in silence, I remember you. She folded the note, placed it carefully in the hat, and stood before she walked away. She glanced back one more time, not expecting anything. But the memory of him lingered like smoke in the air. The next morning, a station worker found the note. He didn't read it, just placed it in the lost and found with the other forgotten things. But later that evening, when no one was watching, a man in a dark coat approached the piano. He stood there for a long time, unmoving. Then he reached down and picked up the hat. When something beautiful disappears without warning, it doesn't feel like closure. It feels like a door left ajar in the middle of the night, just enough to let the cold in, never enough to tell what lies beyond. That's how it felt for her. The pianist was gone. The music that had once been the soundtrack of her Friday nights now existed only in memory. Like a dream she was afraid to forget. She tried to move on. She tried to silence the hope inside her. But some connections are stitched too tightly into the soul. And so, instead of burying the silence, she chose to follow it. She decided to search for him. Not because she thought it would be easy, but because not knowing had become heavier than any truth could be. Her search began where their story had. The station. She returned week after week, questioning anyone who might have seen him. Most shrugged or shook their heads. Others remembered him only vaguely. Oh, the guy who used to play on Fridays. The further she reached, the blurrier he became in everyone else's memory, but not hers. She went to local music shops, asked if anyone knew a pianist who used to play at the station. Most didn't. A few recognized her description. Tall, quiet, always in a coat, played like the world was whispering through him. One old shopkeeper said he remembered a man like that years ago. Bought sheet music, paid in coins, didn't speak much, had sad eyes. She wrote everything down, every detail. She even asked around cafes and bookstores near the station, hoping someone had seen him before or after his performances. Nothing. He was like a melody that faded into silence too quickly. But then, she found something. In a small second-hand bookstore, 2 blocks from the station, she discovered a notebook. It wasn't just any notebook, it was his. She knew it instantly. His handwriting, his phrasing, the short lines of half-finished compositions, musical sketches, the same melodies scribbled again and again in different keys, each variation carrying a new emotional tone. There were no names, no dedications, but she recognized one particular phrase repeated 3 times. For the one who listens. Her. She bought the notebook without hesitation. Inside the back cover, tucked into the last page, was a receipt from a small music school in the southern part of the city dated Montpellier. It was a clue, maybe the only real one she had. She followed it. The school was modest, a single-floor building nestled between apartment complexes and a flower shop. When she asked the receptionist about the man, she was met with a pause, then a nod. "Yes, I remember him. He volunteered here once a week. Taught kids who couldn't afford private lessons. Never gave his full name, just asked them to call him Mr. E." "Mr. E," she smiled. Even his alias sounded like a musical note. "Do you know where he is now?" she asked. The receptionist hesitated. "He stopped coming about 2 months ago, said he needed time away. We tried reaching out, but he never responded. He didn't leave a number, but one of the kids said he was staying at a place near the river, a converted loft for musicians. It's a quiet place, not easy to find." She thanked her and left. The city by the river was older, slower. It breathed differently. Less steel, more stone. Fewer lights, more silence. She wandered the narrow streets until she reached the address the receptionist had scribbled on a sticky note. A gray building with ivy climbing the walls. She climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, uncertain, hands shaking. She knocked. No answer. She knocked again. Then, slowly, the door opened. It was him. Older, somehow. Or maybe just more tired. His face was thinner, his eyes deeper, but it was him. The man who once filled an entire station with emotion, who had become a part of her life without ever knowing her name. Except now, he knew her. He looked at her, and the silence between them was filled with everything they didn't say. Then, softly, almost afraid, "You found me." She nodded. "I didn't think you would look," he whispered. "I didn't think I'd stop," she replied. He stepped aside, let it in. The loft was bare. A few shelves, a sleeping mat, a digital keyboard, and in the corner, a stack of notebooks like the one she'd found, filled with unfinished pieces, scribbled lyrics, fragments of something that had once been whole. She asked why he'd left. He didn't answer immediately. "Then I was tired. Not just in my body, in my heart. Playing became something I needed more than I enjoyed. I started waiting for your notes more than I waited for the music itself. That scared me." She listened. "I disappeared because I thought I had to let go. I thought if I left quietly, it would hurt less." "It didn't," she said. He sat at a keyboard, pressed one key, then another. The same melody she had heard again and again, unfinished, like a question that never got its answer. "I wrote this for you," he said, "but I never finished it. I didn't know how." She stepped closer. "You were never meant to finish it alone." They spent the evening together in the loft. He played, she listened. Then she wrote words that filled the gaps between his notes. Together, they shaped the rest of the song. Not perfect, not polished, but real. Something alive. The next Friday, they returned to the station together. People were surprised, delighted. Some took out their phones. Others simply stopped and listened. But no one knew the story behind the music. No one knew what it took to bring it back. He played, and she stood beside him, not hidden anymore. They didn't speak. They didn't need to, because the song was finished, and it belonged to them both. Every love story has a moment where silence becomes more powerful than words were. A single look can carry the weight of every letter never sent, every note never played, every feeling never spoken aloud. For them, that moment had finally arrived. They had returned to the station not as shadows, not as questions moving through the crowd, but side by side. The man who once played with his eyes closed, and the woman who once watched from the edge of a pillar now stood together in the very place where it all began. People noticed, not in a loud, intrusive way, but in that subtle ripple of curiosity that moves through a crowd when something unusual, something true appears in the middle of an ordinary place. Some passers-by recognized the pianist from months ago. Others simply paused, caught in the quiet magic of the scene. A man at a piano and a woman beside him, notebook in hand, smiling like she'd known the music her whole life. And in a way, she had. He sat down, adjusted the bench, something he hadn't done in a long time, gently opened the lid, then he looked up. At her, not a glance, a gaze, steady, grateful, filled with that strange, soft gravity that only comes when someone sees you fully for the first time and chooses not to look away. She returned the gaze. No fear, no hiding, just presence. The music began. The melody wasn't one the crowd had heard before. It wasn't classical or jazzy or even entirely structured. It was intimate. It wove between keys, like a story being told for the very first time. Each phrase carried echoes of their past. The longing, the distance, the letters in the hat, the missed Fridays, the cert, the reunion. It was a song stitched together by silence and serendipity. And as he played, she stepped forward. She unfolded a page from her notebook, except for a single handwritten phrase at the top. This is how it feels when music writes back. Then she began to read. Not aloud, not to the audience, to him, silently, just with her eyes. Line by line, phrase by phrase, and somehow, even without speaking, he followed her. Each note he played matched the rhythm of her words, as if they had rehearsed it 100 times, though they never had, because what they shared was never rehearsed. It was real, raw, unfinished. Until now, people in the crowd began to realize something unusual was happening. They lowered their phones, they stopped whispering, they simply listened. The music built slowly, gathering emotional momentum without rushing. It swelled in moments of intensity, then fell into soft, delicate silences that let the station's ambient noise filter in, like life itself was part of the arrangement. She stepped closer to the piano, placed her hand gently on the lid. He looked up again, their eyes met, and this Jimmy, something passed between them. Not a message, not a secret, a decision. And in that moment, he lifted his hands from the keys and stopped playing. The station held its breath. Then he stood and faced her fully. This was the part no one had seen coming. Not the commuters, not the staff, not even the pianist himself. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something folded. A note, old, worn, the very first she ever left. Your music makes the world feel less heavy. Thank you for sharing it. She gasped softly. He held it between them like a relic. I kept it, he said. Voice low but steady. All of them. I read them more times than I can count. But this one, this was the first time someone saw me. really saw me." Her eyes welled up. "You saw me too?" she whispered. They stood there, the silence swelling between them, not empty, but full of everything they'd ever said without speaking. Every emotion buried in ink and melody. And then, gently, he stepped forward. "I never said your name," he murmured, "and you never said mine. But I feel like I've known you my entire life." She smiled, trembling. "That's because you've been speaking to me longer than anyone ever has." A hush fell over the station. Even the trains seemed too slow. He reached for her hand. Fingers touched, and just like that, the final note was no longer a sound. It was a moment shared, held, real. Later, when the station had emptied and the lights dimmed, they sat at the piano together, his hands on the keys, hers resting on the edge. "I think I'm done playing for crowds," he said. She turned to him. "Why?" He smiled softly. "Because I finally found the one person I want to play with, not for..." She didn't respond. Instead, she opened her notebook, wrote one last sentence, and slid it across the piano lid. "Maybe love ISN te always loud." Sometimes, it's just a song that keeps playing even after the music stops. He read it, nodded, and together they played once more. Not for the station, not for the people. For them, because their story was never really about the piano. It was about what echoed through the silence between them. And in that silence, they finally heard everything. The end of another beautiful story. Thank you, and please watch the next stories too.